Alright, welcome back to my 2020 album Roundup series. For those of you who didn't catch the first episode of this thing, here are a couple of really quick disclaimers before I get started. First of all, unfortunately, I'm only covering records that came out in the first half of this year, because there was a pretty big chunk of this year to where I wasn't keeping up with stuff, and now I'm just like slowly starting to catch myself back up, but I don't really have organized thoughts on any albums that came out after that point. And also this will just be more casually worded than usual, so, you know, just don't expect perfection on my end. It's a roundup, like, chill out. But yeah, first album I want to cover is Innocent Country 2 by Quelle, Chris, and Chris Keys. First of all, the production on this thing is just so woozy. Like, it just puts me into something of a daze, or it's just like the beats pick me up and I drift in them like they're a river current or something. Especially when like vocals end up the centerpiece of a track, like say Sacred Safe, where Meryl Garbus and Quelle Chris are doing these simple harmonies and kind of giving the illusion that you're hearing like a small choir of some sort. Or say like Sudden Death, which is exclusively sung, and you just have Quelle Chris's whimpery, almost like youthful sounding performance layered, so it sounds like multiple people are singing and just hypnotizing you. And it's like the instruments on this thing are just featherweight. Like, imagine like the texture of cirrus clouds or like cotton candy or something like that. Like, this as a listening experience very much just feels like being surrounded by that. But at the same time, I do think that the pianos are very resonant and have a clear glow, and also an obvious emotional pull a lot of the time. Although I guess on Black Twitter, they are just very dreamy and whimsical. Like, on this track, I could imagine them playing at the same time as like some kind of blue-skied scene in a kid's show or something like that. And I sort of get the same effect from the keys and the flutes on Graphic Bleedouts, at least until drums kind of kick in and bolster the beat up and intensify it. And some of the beats are a little bit more, like, clunky and graceless than that. Like, with the arpeggios all over Horizon, or on Bottle Black Power by The Business. Those sounds that are just like you're in the back of a fast food restaurant, just like tapping all the fryers or some shit. But I feel like beats like this complement how endearingly awkward Quelle Chris can be as just an MC. Like, he comes across as quite nerdy and like a misfit, and also just like human and imperfect. Like, what he says can feel kind of absent-minded and like a little bit confusing at times, and his flows and deliveries are quite stuttery. It's just like deeply immersing yourself into an MC like Quelle Chris can kind of just feel like you were just knocked out and you're all like, and there are just like cartoon birds flying above your head or some shit. And also I kind of feel like the imagery that he uses is pretty overly commonplace, but not in a way that like detracts from it. It's just like he's sending a bigger message using these arbitrary details. So you only really get something out of it if you go in wanting to, or if you go in with a certain lens. I've thought before maybe he could just be trying to say that life is as lame as these very unglamorous details of it are. I don't know. Whether or not that's bullshit, there is definitely just this, like, nothing's that serious, nothing really matters energy kind of clouding over this record, but at the same time, it has something to say, and says it humbly. Like, Black Twitter, for example, find the hook on this track especially endearing, and it's just really soft-hearted and quite an accessible way to frame this message that the beauty in blackness is this straightforward. But then it just becomes a lot more urgent and rebellious when you kind of zoom out and put it in context of this very anti-black society we live in. And I found the line, "every other color is just a refraction of that," to be especially sharp. Horizon I thought was cool, because it kind of suggests that you have to let things end and constantly be reinventing yourself as long as you're alive, but Then Moments comes after that track and has an actual point that it's really hard to avoid just making mistakes left and right as you do so, but it's like clearly sardonic in delivery, and just the fucking air horns on this track are like the icing on the cake for me. But it's like you have this, and then you have like, say, the spoken word outro of Mirage, for instance, which essentially is just very frank about the fact that we're nearing a mass extinction event, and there's really no outright stopping it at this point, only slowing it. I think that is the most striking detail of this track to me, and the way that it suggests that, you know, with this information, you need to do your thing right now, and if there's anything in the world that you have affection for, you need to go towards it immediately, and just keep your loved ones as close as you can as you wait for the end, I guess. And while I think it's a thing that things don't feel that serious on this record, which is a thing that happens as you grow up, I also think that as you grow up, you can start to develop this tendency to just tolerate a pathetic amount of shit from the people you want to keep around, because you're so just afraid of being alone. And I also think that growing up can reveal to you you're a lot pettier than you think deep down, which is why I love Outro Honest so much. It details this very unglamorous, just real human situation that's gotten just excessively toxic and tangled up, and uses very blunt language and core sentiments to kind of preserve all of its ugliness. But then the pianos in this beat just sound utterly drained and crestfallen. It's just like they're being laid to rest in a grave, and it's just such a perfect parallel. And then I feel like the way that Living Happy just busts in directly after that is honestly a genius move, because it's like he's looking at all of the pain and just trying to let himself get totally numb and dead-faced in response to it. And I guess just like forcibly trying to channel all of the adrenaline it's given him into this mindless, perspectiveless happiness. Because the harmonies are just so triumphant and the pianos are so jaunty, and I do think there's some amount of legitimacy to this just because it's happiness that he's achieving without strings attached, but it is like he's almost getting a little bit too high. It's like a manic high or a hyperactive spell, just a very like I'm going to chuck myself out the window type feeling. And I kind of feel like the way that the hook lists all of these literal dances kind of plays into the way that, you know, all of his walls are down and he's just saying and doing anything regardless of whether he makes a fool of himself, because really he just doesn't care about a single element of his life anymore. But yeah, ultimately loved this record so much, grew on me like mad, so do check it out if you're into hip-hop. But yeah, let's talk about this new Christine and the Queens EP, which I've never listened to a single one of Christine and the Queens' projects before, so I am totally ignorant to her as an artist, but thought I would just check this out for the hell of it, and I dug it. I thought the production was pretty rich and resonant and high budget and pretty bassy. I didn't think the instrumentals had a ton of character to them, but I don't necessarily think that that's the end of the world. I thought her vocal melodies were really strong and just popped out in these tracks. And I would say my favorite one is probably Nada, because I just felt like she sounded totally enraptured in what she was saying in the hook. And I liked how those soft whispers kind of lingered throughout the track and very much echoed in my head after I was done listening to it, and I like the little mandolin stings in there too. And then I also kind of dug Mountains We Met, because I just thought Christine's vocal performance on this thing was so tangible, and like I was right there with every word she was saying and every note she was hitting. And I kind of like the sentiment behind this track, how it's just like her saying there are now mountains between her and this person, and really the only thing left to do is write a song about it. So yeah, quite dug this thing. If you like pop music, you might as well give it a shot. Won't hurt, you know? Next up, I want to talk about the new Cindy Lee project. I have so much to say about this thing, and I just don't know how organized it's all gonna be when it comes out of my mouth, but bear with me. So this whole album very much gives me the sense that I'm like at a ballet or something like that. And then some of the instruments on this thing, like that thing on I Want You to Suffer, just very much have this sharp precision about them. Like they're just incisions from like sewing needles or fountain pen tips or something like that. And in the weirdest way, it's like these two things kind of play off of each other because both are just about this fine precision, but one is more about grace and beauty and elegance, and one kind of implies something that could cause you pain. And I think just overall there is very much a sense of torment and violence to the production on this record, like just in how peaky some of the instruments get and whatever effects are being placed on them. And then you have the noise sections, which just evoke like rusted or dirty metal just tearing through the skin or something like that. I kind of picture it like just blood splattered on something beautiful. And then I think there are a lot of old weathered qualities about this album. Like the limit kind of reminds me of tape music, which definitely just evokes that by default. And I also get this sense of like purgatory from this track. So it's like I'm just stuck in a specific scene in an old black and white film that's just playing over and over. And I get a similar sense of just tight claustrophobia from heavy metal, which I guess sounds more like you're just in this never-ending waltz. And then I think the vocals on this record sound pretty weak and aged. It's like you're just hearing an elderly woman sing on her deathbed or something like that. And then there are organs here and there, like the whole outro to I Want You to Suffer, which give me this funeral type feeling. Definitely just feel like I'm having an out-of-body experience when I hear this thing, but there's also like an intimacy to it, so it's like I'm just transcending right in a bedroom. And then I wanted to bring up the vocal sample toward the end of Lucifer's Stand, which I guess suggests that doing the right thing and suffering for it is better than giving into the temptation to do evil. And because it is explicitly stated here, I think that this record on the whole is going for specifically a sense of spiritual corruption or disruption against your will. And also on Lucifer's Stand, I just want to mention the stretchy synth bass on this thing that just kind of flutters over everything. Just feels so much more cold and regulated than everything else on the record, which is a lot more brittle. And for that reason, I just find it to be really satisfying. I think my favorite track on this thing is Speaking From Above. This thing uses this squealy melody that just feels like a bright light making your eyes sting, and then this pulsating bass. And I guess this is a pretty expected combination to use for a track on this record, but simultaneously there is this ramshackle noise just looming above everything that is pulled to all of these different pitches and just sounds like it's violently tearing you apart in all directions by all different methods, and it's excruciating. And to me, it's just this parallel very eerily feels like just going about your life deadpan when something's just made your mental state spiral into chaos. And it's like, okay, I'm doing things, but like, holy shit. And then Just for Loving You, I Pay the Price directly after that. Kind of sounds like it's sucking up all of the chaos and just flushing it away, or it's like it's all just swirling above your head and it's gone now and you just have to deal with the damage it left. Really loved this record, and it was one of those records that got better for me every listen, so I would say keep trying with it if it's just not doing it for you. Next up, I want to talk about this new Code Orange project, which, to be completely honest, totally missed the mark for me. Like, it's just trying to do so much at once, and stylistically, it's like all that it's trying to mix just feels totally discordant. And compositionally, it's like, I know that that is the point, and to some extent, metalcore is supposed to be unkempt and disheveled, but like, this is just excessive. And like, little was compelling enough for me to grab onto and like, allow to guide the experience of a whole track. Yeah, like 3 listens in, it just, I felt like my brain was gonna burst open trying to like this thing. And you know, the instrumentals are heavy and pummeling, and they'll randomly glitch here and there, like just little muscle spasms or twitches, or it's like, you know, it's just getting snagged or like smeared up for a note. But it's herky-jerky in a way that is a lot more grating than thrilling, and the emotion on this record just isn't that tangible at all to me. A lot of the vocals just kind of make me want to die, and the melodic moments aren't that compelling. And it's one of those records to where it's like, the best moments are abundantly obvious to me, and then I can take or leave like half the track list, like Back Inside the Glass and Autumn and Carbine and Last Ones Left and Cold Metal Place. And to be fair, I've never been much of a Code Orange person in the past, but thought I would just give this a shot anyway and see what happens, and sadly didn't really hit, but it is what it is. Next up, I want to talk about this new Dan Deacon record, Mystic Familiar, which honestly is just a record that makes me feel so blessed to have a group of people that will actually listen to what I have to say about albums, because I just love it so fucking much, and the longer I think about it, the more I get chills. First track I want to bring up, I guess, is Become a Mountain. I like how the lyrics on this thing kind of suggest, like, literally becoming a part of your surroundings or the earth, just like becoming indifferent as an inanimate object, and achieving this sense of like emotional equilibrium, but being able to still tell that all the color in the world is there. It's like the greatest state you can achieve, and I love how Dan sounds really mystified by or indulged in what he's saying, like he's kind of whispering on this track. And I like how the pianos on this track start off tight, and then they start to open up and give way for the track to just be taken over by these kaleidoscopic whirlwinds. And just in general on this record, I like how these crystal clear, compact instruments kind of start to become flexible or elastic and bleed into the electronics. I feel like every sound on this thing, like synthetic or not, just feels so incredibly natural. And I like how there are kind of these little squeaky noises in there, because they just make everything feel a lot less rigid and almost like animate or alive in the weirdest way. It's like you're just in the Amazon rainforest being surrounded by all these bugs or animals or something. And I feel like when this record uses saxes, everything just becomes a lot more adventurous and cinematic. It's like all of a sudden I'm embarking on this grand expedition or quest or something. The whole record just feels like some kind of escape to me. Like just going somewhere where you can neutralize yourself and see very clearly every incredible thing that's ever happened to you, and everything else just kind of disappearing. And like letting all of that just hit you all at once in just this unbearable rush. And I feel like the main reason why that's communicated so well is just because of the sheer density of the instrumentals and the way that the instruments are just brought together into these giant, relentless swarms. And also just the way that Dan's vocals are mixed. Like, it's like they're just another instrument, so he's just being totally surrounded by and smothered inside of all of it. And I do admit that his vocals aren't like incredible sounding. I could see them coming across as a bit tacky, but for me they just have this amateurish charm about them and just kind of reinforce the fact that the only thing this record is really concerned with is just communicating this unbearably intense feeling that is just straight up about to burst out of your chest at any second. And in certain moments, in order to do that, I feel like it knows it's risking coming across as kind of overly sentimental or cheesy, but that just kind of sells it more for me, man. Just kind of sells it more for me. I don't know, just every part of this record feels so believable and honest to me. Like, on My Friend, when he kind of shouts, "I'm still alive, I'm screaming," like, that set of words will always kind of hit me in the gut regardless, I do admit, but just in context of this record, they feel that much more moving, I think. And I like the stuttery synths on this track that kind of start to speed up and become these ringlets, and I also love Fell into the Ocean. I think the pulsating synths that just kind of exist underneath everything are just so satisfying on this track. Like, they're just so bright and glossy and sleek, and I like how this track suggests that you're doing a lot better than you think, and there's a lot more around you to appreciate than you think. All you really need is a bit of perspective, or maybe like someone else's perspective to help get you there. And then Weeping Birch in this track list is just like, boom, instant sense of vulnerability. Suddenly there are tears streaming down my face. How did that happen? But yeah, love this whole record so much, and just could probably talk about it for a very long time, but I don't want to, you know, make this video any longer than it's already probably gonna be, so I'm gonna shut the fuck up for you and leave it for my year-end list. Next up, I want to talk about this new Deerhoof record, Future Teenage Cave Artists, which, first of all, I just want to throw out there that I've never dived into Deerhoof stuff like that, so take whatever I say with kind of a grain of salt. For me personally, this is a record that I can listen to and hear redeeming qualities in, but for me it's like everything just seems to clash on this album. Like, I think my main issue is just that I don't think vocals like this belong on an album that sounds this anxious and strident. And, you know, it's like the guitars on this thing are pretty raspy and jagged, and the bass and drums on this thing sound pretty raw, and the rhythms are unconventional, which definitely can be cool. It's just like the rope holding the album together is about to snap at any second, or it's like pulling your brain wires in ways that they really shouldn't go. I guess it's just that sometimes when the timbres are oppressive enough too, it can just feel like way too much. Or it's just like everything is way too at odds with one another in a track. But to give this thing fair credit, it does sound unlike anything I've ever heard before. It's just that for me, it ranged from grating to mildly interesting. Like, it was never legitimately alluring to me. But if you like the sound of this record, you know, maybe you'll be able to get into the whole concept behind it, which has to do with oncoming apocalypse, I think. Like, I didn't get that far because time is a limited and valuable resource, and I simply didn't want to spend it listening to a record that was constantly activating my fight or flight response. So I hope you understand, but there is like legitimate talent to be found here, so I would like give it a shot. Let's talk about this new like Denzel Curry, Kenny Beats thing, Unlocked. Is this an album? I guess it's like a full fucking album, I don't know. I'm not gonna talk about like Denzel's bars on this thing because like he freestyled the entire project, and like I don't think that's what we're supposed to fixate on necessarily. I think in Outer Space he's suggesting that like in order to escape all of the atrocities he's been through, he has to kind of go into the like the weird shit. He has to do the rap thing. But as a whole, I kind of feel like if you take away the visuals and the fact that the intended concept behind this thing is creative and just judge it based on the listening experience, it is kind of scant as a full project. Like, it's really just a quick set of bangers, and I guess if I'm gonna hear that from anyone, Denzel Curry is not the worst candidate. I do feel like his performances and also all the vocal pitching on this thing just gives it a little bit of extra color. I think the production's cool. On the low, I find the beats to be kind of forgettable though, and I feel like the songs on this thing generally are a little bit too loose and spontaneous for their own good. And there are a few cool moments in there, I guess, like Take It Back has this part with these weird clicky drums that's a little bit satisfying. I do remember though, this track started with like the most obnoxious beepy synth that just like kept repeating the same note over and over, and I just remember reacting like, make it end, but luckily it didn't last that long. But yeah, that was a thing. The drums on Diet are pretty cool. They kind of sound like sticks denting aluminum cans at varying forces or something like that. So Yeah, not like mad that this project happened or anything like that, but I can't imagine it'll ever like actually cross my mind again. So hey, if you're a fan, I guess, you know, why not check it out? But yeah, next up I want to talk about the new Destroyer record, which Destroyer. You really fucked this one. The lyrics on this thing strike me as so weak and nondescript. Like, Dan Behar's lyricism has been vague in the past, but I feel like this is just a little bit excessive. And I hate saying this about artists, so I'll never say it unless I truly believe it, but it's like songs are just made up of these random, like, clusterfucks of just trains of thought that don't add up to anything or connect together in any way, and all just kind of try to fall back on the idea that they're supposed to be abstract in one piece, you know? Like, I guess sometimes he'll hint at a philosophical idea or a political point, but he never gets all the way there, and the majority of this just reads like, the world is shit, my mind's in oblivion, here's a random theater reference, like, thank you, Dan Behar, but we've gotten this from you like 30,000 times at this point. Can we get like something more? It's so funny too, because it's like all of the least likable parts of Dan Behar's personality for some reason are just on full display here. Like, with lines like, just look at the world around you, wait, no, don't look, and the music makes a musical sound. And the part in Q Synthesizer where like he calls in all of the instruments as they arrive in the track, it's just like, shut the fuck up. And I feel like the best way to describe the instrumentals on this thing is like just a bunch of leftover food kind of slapped together and reheated and served as like a slightly mushy meal. Also, the bass and drums on this thing just feel so much stiffer and drier and more restrictive than they were on, say, an album like Kaput, which I guess this is a little bit similar to stylistically. But it's like the blissful elements of the production here, like the ambient parts and the synths, just feel so much more watery and like default than they did on that record. And the very glamorous sounding guitars, which are kind of the only thing making the production pass here, just feel like they can't like open up and fly free on this record for some reason. And it's like Behar's performances also just suck for some reason. Like, he just drawls his way through this thing and it's just not that pleasant. Don't know, this kind of was quite disappointing for me as a pretty big Destroyer fan. Next up, I want to talk about the new album by the band Dogleg, mostly because I feel like someone watching this video would love it. I actually don't have that much to say about it myself. Exclusively because for me, pop punk and emo are just genres that I have beef with in their entirety, which I know is kind of lame, but I'll elaborate more on that when I talk about Jeff Rosenstock, because I feel like it's more relevant to that album than this album, because this also has a lot of like post-hardcore sensibilities about it, so it's not like completely detracting from the experience to me. Like, I still think this is a very musically thick and brawny album, and the progressions are very careful and detailed, and it's very emotionally charged too. Like, the imagery on here is vivid, it's very destructive and just catastrophic, like, my mental state's in flames type shit. And yeah, lyricism consistently evokes something. I will say that for me, it's kind of hard to find, like, definitive points to the tracks here. Like, these lyrics kind of feel like they should mean something greater, but they never really seem to. At least from how I read them, but maybe I'm just dumb. But if it doesn't, like, bother you that these lyrics are more just about vaguely implying like a sense of anxiety, then you'll probably dig this. There's not much about it that isn't to like, so definitely recommend it. And next up I want to talk about this new Fax Gang EP, which I've had so much fucking fun with this year, and it just seems to get better every time I hear it. First of all, it's really noisy, and there's a lot of bit crushing going on it. Like, it just sounds fucking mutilated. So, for that reason, I would probably use a lot of imagery of, like, pixel screens if I were to write about it. I would say that outro and centrifuge just kind of sounds like a phone call is, like, slowly breaking up. Or it's, like, consistently throughout this thing, just frayed wiring is, like, shocking or electrocuting you. And also the vocals sound really static-kissed and compressed, so I can imagine them coming out of a walkie-talkie, or them being these distant transmissions. And playing off of that, I mean, it's like if you just look at the graphic design, it's like very blatantly suggesting space travel, but it's also got kind of like a retro thing going on, and simultaneously, I feel like when I listen to this, I just get a very distinctly 2020 feel from it. Like, that probably just has to do with the cloud rap and the trap stylings about it. Like, you do have these very oppressive, skittery hi-hats on here. And yeah, it's just like these clear implications of the past, the present, and the future all kind of colliding. And simultaneously, the way that everything is just so artsy and like chopped up on this thing makes it feel like something of a spiritual experience to me. So the only conclusion that I can draw is that it's like you're just hearing all of it outside of space and time. And another one of my favorite things about this is just how blatantly it kind of wears the fact that it was birthed out of internet culture. Like, like I feel like this thing sounds like it could have been like corrupted by the deep web, or like 4chan or something like that. Or it's like the auditory equivalent to like one of those deep fried memes or something. Not to suggest that there's no substance here at all, but it just kind of got that about it, you know what I mean? And I don't know if this is just me, but I always imagine this EP taking place somewhere animated. Like, I just get mad cartoon character vibes from the pitch shifting and the icy auto-tune being applied to the vocals, and I also think the synths have kind of like an iciness or a gleam to them as well, so I guess that's a consistent thing throughout. I don't know why, but I get a very distinctly like pastel color feel from this thing, and when I listen to it, I definitely just cannot get the image out of my head of melted ice cream. And I guess my best guess at why is because of the repetitive or mind-melting elements of the production here. And in terms of like more specific moments of the production I really like, I think it's quite satisfying when the drums sound like they're just actively chopping everything up. Like on Soaked, the way that they sound like these just like flappy knife machines or some shit. And also, I think this thing just sounds like it's about to bust at certain moments just because this very thunderous, earthquake-inducing sub-bass is being used. Like, say, at the beginning of Breathe 2, which just has this very physical, like, floor-shaking thump to it. And I also think it's really satisfying how this thing just stamps down these pitched vocals along with the drums, because it just makes the track start with this sense of determination and tenacity, and it's like it's just putting it in between bars in a way. And I also think it's super gratifying how at the end the vocals just start to soar, and the drum pattern changes, and the tempo gets faster, because it's just like you're getting kicked in the face right at the end, or hit with a rush of adrenaline. And Jeopardy is just kind of like a 10 out of 10 track for me, no question about it, really. It has these vocals that are quite squeaky. I guess they're chipmunked, and there might be a couple of other effects on them, and they're just arranged and looped in like the most satisfying way. And the vocal melodies themselves on this thing are quite repetitive, like that repeated is especially numbing, and it's like the longer it goes on, the more you're kind of losing control to it. And just all of this fizzy noise drenches the track, and these arpeggios just slip underneath everything, and eventually it's like the whole thing just starts to slow down and be stretched out, and it's just kind of like you're gradually being submerged in the sun, or like this blinding light, or some kind of weird, like, half heaven, half purgatory. Because again, it's like you're just losing all control of your brain and your body, just one limb at a time. And yeah, you gotta hear this thing. It's like super short, so you probably don't have any valid excuse not to. Like, you could just play this shit on your lunch break at your shitty 9 to 5, like I did. And, you know, I felt significantly more dope after clocking back in. So just let this improve your life. Seriously. Next up, I want to talk about this new Fennec record, which I kind of mentioned in the first episode of this video that house by default is always kind of pensive or just nostalgic experience for me, so that's very much what this is. And my favorite track on this thing is probably Frontier Identity, which uses these clicky sounds and these strings that are super, like, distant and minute and fluttery. And the track just uses these dreary streams of instruments that feel really loose and like they have a lot of slack on them. So it's just like your heart or your stability is just spilling out all over the place into a puddle. Or it's like you're featherweight, you don't weigh anything, and you're like releasing grip on something that you were previously clinging very tight to. And it's a little sad, but it's like obvious in the moment that that's what has to happen. And you're just like watching it all fall away. And for some reason, it doesn't feel that serious or pressing. Like your only responsibility really is to just reflect on it. And the pianos on this track are just so fucking gorgeous, and really the keys in general on this thing are just so sedative and alleviating. And I do think the tracks that have these drearier melodies generally go over better than the ones that are groovier and more disco influenced. Not that those are necessarily bad, but I can feel a couple of them getting a bit static, or it's like the central groove just isn't quite engaging enough to carry it. And I also just kind of think that the way that the effects are handled and the mixes on some of these tracks can feel a bit awkward, although that's like simultaneously the only thing giving some of these tracks character. So I'm kind of conflicted on what to do, but generally, I just think that more obvious personality and more memorable melodies would probably help this thing out, although I did enjoy the experience. And next up, I want to talk about the new Fortet record, which I feel like if you've been following Fortet up until this point, it's pretty easy to see what this is trying to be. It is another one of those records that just, by default, puts me into a super pensive, nostalgic state. But I would say when compared with Fortet's other work, like say Rounds or There Is Love in You, the melodies on this thing are a lot less solemn and just emotionally heavy. Like, this just feels totally content and just accepting of everything in the past and the present. Like, it just makes life seem a lot easier than it actually is to me. And the instruments on this thing just are super clear and luminous, like especially the pianos, which just are like these gemstones with transparent surfaces that just have a bit of a shine to them. Like, it is all just super even-tempered and placid and sonorous, and I guess the instruments are quite airy, which does naturally come with the harpsichords and the wind chimes for sure. And I guess the pads on this thing do sound kind of dull and blank, but ultimately, I mean, they are just there kind of bolstering everything up, and the record is very much just repping this simple beauty anyway, and it is also definitely trying to evoke a mix between, like, autumn and spring if you just look at the cover and the track titles and, you know, the fact it's using all of these field recordings. Like, it is just all over this thing, and I would say just evoked very effectively. And this record just has such a tenderness to it. Like, it's very just like, you know, you're wrapped in a blanket, you're sipping cocoa, like that kind of warmth. And I guess my favorite track on this thing is probably Romantics, which just is frickin' twinkly AF. And there's like this fluid thing just kind of dangling or swaying freely in there. And there's like the illusion that it's moving from side to side. And then these camera click sounds just kind of cut into the track. And I don't know, I guess just the balance between these two things is really satisfying to my ears. And I also love the way that this track layers on that harpsichord, and then these pitched vocals just kind of rise out of everything. Just feels like a super celestial moment to me. And I feel similarly about the way that the Ellie Goulding sample is on Baby. Here I guess it's chopped and layered and manipulated in a way that feels really smart and kind of just manages to carry the whole track for me and keep me coming back. And the drums on School are quite minute and definitely not in your face, but I think that they do just enough. And just that little timbre in there that sounds like an animal snarl or like munch or something like that is super satisfying. And then I guess the drums on Insect Near Piha Beach feel quite blunt, and they're 4 to the floor and pretty dry in timbre. So for that reason, they mostly just paint the scene in the track for me. Like, I can imagine either being right outside a club or being inside a club, but a little bit removed from the situation. And then there's this stringed instrument that must have a lot of fucking strings, because it just keeps, like, climbing out of that and just unfurling and vegetating, and I just think there's something to be said about this contrast between something that is so cold and calculated and something that has so much warmth. And I think the only melody on this entire thing that I didn't like was the flute on Teenage Birdsong. Just found it to be a little bit irritating. But other than that, all around this was a really pleasant experience. And, you know, if you're into electronic music or just kind of want to be put totally at ease, I would definitely recommend this because you might love it. And next up, I want to talk about this new Frances Quinlan record, which, first of all, are her vocal cords okay? And does she need a throat lozenge? Like, obviously she has incredible range and just so much command over whatever instrumental she's on. And I don't know, like, her vocals just feel super vivacious and just do some shit to my chest. And I guess if we're getting over the top, they just sound like they're radiating so much light, or just like opening me up to this light that I didn't know could exist in a world like this. And this is really a small detail of like the overall picture of her lyricism, but I like when you have that combined with just a pretty commonplace setting or scenario or imagery, because it just reminds me of like finding that in mundane things. And I don't know, like, by default, Hopalong's material just makes me stupidly enthusiastic to, like, wake up in the morning and live. It's just a gut reaction. And I like how on their material as well, you have this peppy, sprightly rock instrumentation, because it just makes it feel like this more holistically exhilarating experience, like, especially on Painted Shut. And, you know, everything that is stand out about this was kind of a given going in, like, it's really her vocals and I guess the lyricism, which is odd because it's definitely using storytelling here and there, but it's like nothing she says is ever that concrete, and it's also really verbose. So I guess this kind of just makes me see her overall goal as like this search for raw truth or enlightenment, and a very overwhelming one considering the vocals, but also one where she doesn't exactly have a clear path. My favorite track on this thing is definitely Went to LA. I just think this is a perfect song. First of all, on this thing you have the line, "Out of self-preservation did I begin with tenderness," which just makes me think about how you start your life with this base level, no strings attached belief in compassion and going towards what can give you affection. But the more you live, the more you realize how easy it is for just outside circumstances to kind of take that away from you. And just your knowledge of this kind of fucks up your approach to everything. And then there's also the line, Oh, the humiliation of having been perfectly understood, if I could observe beyond every open mouth, which I think mostly she's getting at the fact that everyone kind of has these ideas of who they want to be, and it's just a shame that you can only really do what you can do, and maybe she wants to be taken more for what she's trying to be than what she actually is. Or she could just be suggesting that she wants to kind of get away from the polished facade that people put out into the world and just escape into her brain. And then, obviously, you have the line, "Heaven is a second chance," which I took as, like, heaven is a second chance to be someone else. And that also comes with her implying that she's physically escaping away to a new location, and as she's doing so, saying, like, what does it matter who I'm with right now if ultimately everyone just wants to be something other than what they are, and regardless, I'll just feel alone in my mind anyway. And I just love the light little guitar strums on this track, and how meanwhile she's just like belting it out, and that like chance, like the additional layer that just kind of tops it off really nicely. And yeah, I think my main issue with this record as a whole is just that everything that I like about it, I feel like I can find to a fuller extent in Hopalong's material, but I wouldn't call it like a waste of time or anything like that. Like, I still enjoyed hearing it, and yeah. Next up, I want to talk about this new Freddie Gibbs Alchemist project, Alfredo, which, first of all, gangster rap is not exactly my lane when it comes to music discussions, so I didn't go into this expecting to find, like, my album of the year or anything, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I do think that Freddie is technically a really masterful rapper. Like, just the way that he flows and switches between flows and delivers his words are all honestly really satisfying. I've said in the past that his lyricism isn't my favorite thing in the world. I think it just comes down to the fact that the way he frames what he's been through is exclusively very callous and cutthroat, and I personally like it a little bit better when artists just show a little bit more humanity, but at the same time, it's definitely not my place to tell him that he's going about it in the wrong way, and he's certainly not the first to do it like this. And honestly, it does kind of work because just if you're engaged in what he's saying and you care, like, there's just going to be things that he mentions that hit you in the gut just because of the sheer weight of what he's talking about. But, like, still, he is very much always telling and never showing. And I think my problem is just that the way that I approach listening to hip-hop is I try to find some quality about the lyricism that I find captivating, and then I can kind of form a bond with an MC and, like, work from that. But, like, when I'm trying to pay attention to everything else but that, it's just kind of like a weird mental acrobatics thing, and, like, I'm never that fulfilled by the outcome. Like, I just don't think that I approach listening to hip-hop in the same way a hip-hop head would, but it does help that this project sounds so generally likable and attractive. Like, I can't picture anyone hearing these beats and being put off by them. Like, they use these piano samples, which are really emotive and almost melodramatic sounding, and these strings that feel really cinematic, as do the literal snippets from movies, obviously. But yeah, all around it just sounds gut-wrenchingly eerie and even intimidating when you have a rapper as ruthless as Freddie spitting over it. God is Perfect is a track that all around I think sounds great. I just love, like, that spectral drone that just kind of swells out of it. Like, it just tops it off perfectly, and just my ears are always drawn to it right away when I hear this track. To me, it just kind of feels like a disoriented feeling in my head, just, like, catching up to me. And I also just think that Freddie's flows on this track are super satisfying, and the hook is really snappy. And then I think it's kind of cool how the strings and just the rhythm of Baby Shit kind of make you feel like you're just drifting through the track or, like, levitating in it. And then, of course, there are those, like, fairy tale-esque sparkles in there. But all of that kind of contrasts with the vulgarity and just filth of what Freddie's talking about and the speed that he picks up on this track. And then I really like Something to Rap About just all around. I think it's cool how on this track Freddie gets pretty nostalgic and just reflective on everything he's had to endure to get to this position. And I also really like Tyler the Creator's verse, honestly. I like how he's talking about his fame and his wealth in context of his blackness, and also how on this track he suggests that he's gonna buy a boat and then jump off of it. Because, like, I took this as him saying he has gotten to this technically great place in his career and financially, so he could just sabotage all of it at his own discretion and end up in a better place than he was in before he started out, so he's kind of already succeeded in a sense. And also he just knows what's really important and that this isn't it. And I also just think he fits perfectly over this beat because the guitars just sound so islandy. And yeah, all around really enjoyed this record, would come back to it, so I would say check it out. And next up I want to talk about this new Micaiah McCraven rendition of Gil Scott-Heron's I'm New Here, which, you know, I do think that the original leaned a little bit too bare bones, but at the worst of that, it did kind of just give more power to his poetry. And, you know, here you have these, like, clean, bright jazz instrumentals that do feel more filled out in a sense, but for me it's kind of a trade-off because some of the melodies just don't make that strong of an impact and kind of just sit at a surface level. And, you know, for as imperfect as the original was, it did have this very fluid human quality about it, and this by comparison just feels a little bit stiff and sterile for some reason. And in certain moments it's like all the suspense has been drained out too. Like, the original version of Me and the Devil had these subtle but high impact strings and bass keys, and this version just isn't even half as moving. And, you know, I do like this version of I'm New Here. Like, it has this just wash of twinkling instrumentation, and I feel like the vibraphone and the harp just have this floaty, angelic quality about them that I do like. But at the same time, I did really feel like just the rustic guitar on the original gave it this glumness and this human touch that I was really attached to. And as far as this version of Where Did the Night Go goes, I really like how it starts out with this just cartoonish sense of apprehension, like with that flute. I guess I just kind of wish that that drama was carried through the whole track and it didn't just kind of devolve after the beginning. Like, the flute just starts to flounder around and this really dry drum groove kicks in and then the track's just over. And I also just really like the idea of this track being longer than it was on the original, honestly, because it actually has one of my favorite poems on the whole thing, just to do with how when you love someone enough, they take up enough space in your brain to, like, just waste hours and hours of your life away when you really sit down and think about it. And also, like, the lack of flow on this thing is really funny to me because it's like there was really no flow to the original either, but the tracks have just been shuffled around here seemingly for the sake of it. I don't know, it's a really weird move to make, but yeah, I would say, like, if you love the original album, why not check this out? But I still kind of doubt that it'll, like, blow you out of the water or anything like that, but maybe you listen to music in a very different way from me, which obviously is fun, so give it a shot. But yeah, next up I want to talk about this new Grimes album, which, first of all, like, I have always been so struck by just how fearlessly weird this girl is. Like, she truly does come across like she is just from her own fucking realm, just, like, filled with mythological creatures or some bullshit like that. And, on top of that, she addresses darkness in this very, like, melodramatic way that just makes me feel like I'm reading a fiction novel sometimes in, like, the best way possible. And on top of that, she has this really, like, sour, high-pitched vocal register that just makes her come with this excessive amount of femininity. And she also has this really animalistic delivery and just fiery, explosive temper. And all of this together is quite the statement, to say the least. I feel like I'm most into her when, like, I'm going through a phase of my life to where I want to be substituting emptiness for just a ridiculous amount of personal expression, so someone like this just starts to look like God to me. And I do just feel like she has a lot of command over whatever instrumental she ends up on, so I just want to make sure you know that assuming these qualities carried over onto this record, they were just going to be positives by default for me, so I'm going in with a certain amount of bias. But the production on this record is quite thin and just airy and agile. It's just like a bunch of down feathers in your face or something. And on top of that, it is super giant for just a lot of the runtime. Like, it just feels like this straight imperial bliss. And I guess when you get used to that, it does kind of start to lose impact. And, you know, there's a lot of reverb on this production. Like, it feels like the melodies are just being emitted through, like, a fog machine or some shit because of that. And the mixes do get quite muddy and just swampy. Like, just take the first track, for example, where it's just like all of this texture is just loosely sloshing around. And the mixes on this thing do get quite muddy and swampy. Like, just take the first track, for example, where it's like all this texture is just kind of loosely like sloshing around. But I do really like this as an opener because I feel like it very vividly introduces you to the world of the album, like wherever the fuck that is. And I also like 4 AM to an extent, because I like the rainforest vibe it's got going on, and also the breakbeat just kind of sounds like it's sprinting or booking it forward, but I do kind of feel like it gives the album experience more than it is like a standout song on its own. And I guess that like Violence and You'll Miss Me When I'm Not Around also have a certain amount of punch to them, but like, would I come back to them on their own? Probably not. But I do quite like My Name is Dark. The guitars on this thing just sound like these weird, like, messed up, just scratches on the skin, and Grimes sounds especially animalistic here. Like, I like the way that her scream is kind of outstretched for a second too, because it's just like she's being stopped in place, and then the production and the explosion just feels like it's lifting you off the ground for a second. Like, I just felt like that was a super satisfying moment. And I do admit the lyrics on this cut could warrant an eye roll. Like, this is Grimes at her most just unapologetically dumb, but for me it's like she's selling it super well, so I don't really have a problem with it. By the way, I just want to kind of pause this video for a second to put in like a legitimate trigger warning for anyone who's especially affected by rape or sexual abuse. Like, I would say just mute the video for the rest of the time that I talk about Grimes. I just would hate to like hit you with this out of the blue without telling you. But my favorite track on this thing is probably Dark Side, because like the first several times that I heard this track, I thought she was saying we don't love our bodies anymore. And then I looked up the lyrics, and according to Genius, she is actually saying we don't move our bodies anymore. So I feel stupid because this kind of just fucked up my entire train of thought behind this thing. It just made me think about like all the different ways that you can start to hate having a body, like body dysmorphia or traumatizing sexual experiences, because I feel like once you see in real time how poorly someone can treat you for your body while simultaneously reaping the benefits of it, you can just start to hate having one and stop taking care of it and just see anything remotely sexual as a threat. And I just like the idea of hearing this sentiment surrounded by a super evil, just demented sounding instrumental. And also, like, Pawn on this track just sounds like she's being overcome by peril and just scrambling around or like actively attacking you or fighting back. So I think that's really effective too. And I like how the bass just sounds like it's being drilled into this track. And then like there'll be like a fizzy cloud that just blasts out for a note. Like, regardless of whether that actually is the lyric or not, I just think the oppressive qualities about this track are really compelling. So yeah. Next up, I want to talk about this new Hania Rani album, which genuinely is so gorgeous, I don't know how to do it justice. I I definitely get the illusion that the pianos on this thing just have no control over where they're going. Like, sometimes it's like they're all just dribbling down and giving me this sense of free falling. And sometimes it's more like they're gathering together into these bunches or swarms and just moving forward really eagerly, or like just prancing around like bunnies in the springtime or some shit. But at the same time, there's such a sense of just deadness and decay to this thing, so imagine like a graveyard filled with flowers or something. And also it's just like, Jesus Christ, her voice just communicates so much ache. Like, she is just so ripe with feeling, it's like she's an open wound. And also on this album, you can kind of hear the natural sounds of the instruments being handled, which I think is a nice touch. And on Letter to Glass, it kind of sounds like just a clock ticking, so that sort of puts this sense of impending doom into the track and just like looms over everything, so that's one example of it being used in a really smart way. And I also really love the track 0 Hour for the fact that the piano chords just feel a lot more weighty and cold and glum, and this track also has like this panting that just pans ear to ear. So I always imagine this one taking place somewhere just like covered in sheets of ice. And there's also like this really tense plucked instrument in there that just kind of sounds like bugs or like beetles just scurrying up a tree trunk. Or like, what are the wood bugs? Are those termites? Like, I don't fucking know. Whatever the wood bugs are, that is what I'm talking about. And then you have the track Summer, which, this might be a reach, but sometimes when I hear just direct samples of nature in music, like the birds twittering on this track, I just get this very pure and unadulterated sense of healing out of it that almost feels too good to be true. So you have that for the majority of this thing, and then towards the very end, there's just this cry that just sounds exactly like a baby animal in pain to me. And I guess just the thought of something this fragile and breakable in a world this cutthroat is pretty excruciating. And then I also found it really interesting how the lyrics on Home suggested like rebirth both by nature and by sadness, or I guess just the truth. But yeah, I found this to be a really worthwhile listen, and I think it was probably my favorite lesser-known release that I checked out this year, so just based on that alone, I would give it a shot. Next up, I want to talk about this new HMLTD, which is quite a ride. Like, I guess primarily it's like a glam punk, post-punk, dance punk kind of crossover. It has like quite a gothic style to it, and also the lead vocalist sounds pretty flamboyant, and there's like a really over-the-top, just thespian kick to the instrumentals. And it's definitely one of those records to where like every track is doing something totally different, and even within tracks, like there are just these instrumental moments that definitely could rub you the wrong way. Like To the Door should go hard, but I don't know if I can get with that part where it just sounds like you were thrown into this ditch filled with sub-bass and trap beats. Like, it just sounds like totally separate from everything else going on in it, and it's like this should be two separate songs or something, like, but they were just shoved into one. I don't know. But like, I guess in some kind of way, generally speaking, it does kind of work for me, because I feel like there's a certain amount of self-awareness to this record. Like, it just has a super fuck it kind of energy to it. And I also think that like the nihilism in the lyrics kind of just makes it all feel like a purposefully showy and eclectic temper tantrum over the 21st century. And for me, it's like, I feel like it hits the hardest when that nihilism is kind of met with spaghetti western guitars and satanic imagery and desert imagery, like, say, on Satan, Luella and I, where I think the narrator has, like, wandered to the outskirts of functioning society and is now just kind of all like, I'm a burnout, I'm a failure, blah, and just indulging in all of this bad karma. And then I guess getting to this point where he's just trying to convince both this other person and himself that it isn't that bad. And honestly, I also really like Loaded just for how it suggests like becoming completely empowered by the fact that you're just letting all of your dreams die somehow, and like I guess seeking out revenge for it and becoming almost this like town supervillain type character. I just love how that's the component of this track that makes it theatrical, and also how the guitars just kind of bust in after the hook and just sound like you're throwing shit around, just like tearing the place apart. I think it's really fitting. And I also really like the opener on this thing, The West is Dead, just for how it sort of delivers this message that like literally all of Western civilization is good as dead, using these very like sensual, breathy vocals. But yeah, found this to be a really interesting listen. I would give it a shot just because it's probably unlike anything else you'll hear this year. So yeah, now I want to talk about the new Jeff Rosenstock album, which I just want to make sure you know before I do that I would never like sit down and formally review an album in this style. Just because I kind of have issues with like this whole wave of modern pop punk and haven't loved an album that I've heard in this style in like the past 5 years anyway, so there is definitely some amount of bias going on here, but basically it's just that like when pop punk comes with these vocals with a certain degree of just artificial whininess and an instrumental that just has that faux epic quality about it, I'm just not that into it for obvious reasons. But also, like, on a record like this, even just the anthemic choruses don't really make that much sense to me on paper, because it's like, okay, now this is more fitting for, like, a concert setting or a social setting or something like that. For me, that just kind of recontextualizes it in a way that cheapens it, or at least just makes it feel significantly less serious, which honestly, in the case of Jeff Rosenstock, I think is fine, just because he also kind of has a sense of humor about him. And also even, like, some of the melodies on a record like Worry had this, like, fake, cheery quality about them that kind of made them feel a bit ironic. And I feel like his vocals work because they're so intentionally over the top, but they also do come with a lot of real force and drive, and it also helps that so many of his instrumentals are performed with so much just tangible sorrow. And also, I mean, I love his lyricism. Like, I feel like he has some pretty sharp commentary on social and political issues, and I feel like you don't get this type of thing as much in pop punk as you do punk, generally speaking, so I like it for that reason. And I just feel like he very much communicates that everyone else's pain is his pain as well. And on top of that, of course, he just displays very confidently all of the ugliest and least glamorous parts of getting older and sort of the depression that can come out of that, and kind of what it's like to be 40 and feel like you're in a midlife crisis, or you're just a lazy, unmotivated, unsuccessful piece of shit. But yeah, to talk a little bit more specifically about this record, first of all, I have some issues with the instrumentals. Like, I've heard this thing several times, but for some reason I cannot remember a single one, which I don't know why, because I feel like when I'm listening to it, like, I feel the punch and the performances are very full throttle, but it's just like whatever's happening at a given moment just isn't interesting enough to actually fixate on and become invested in what's about to happen next. And, you know, the arrangements are very messy and ratty, which is generally fine, but maybe I would be a little bit more okay with that if the guitars had a bit more tone to them. Like, really, this could mostly be a tonal issue. And when it comes to the lyricism, I think it just bothers me that, like, all of my takeaways had to be really small, intricate details, and were just kind of scattered throughout the record. Like, I have an issue, I guess, with, like, the lack of broader sense of identity here. Like, on Worry, for example, you had a lot about consumerism and gentrification, and on We Cool, you had this sense of, like, you know, all my friends are moving on without me, and everything that I kind of subconsciously expected to have forever is gone. And on Post, you had this kind of more vague and abstract sense of just cataclysm or like post-apocalypse following the 2016 election. And like, sure, each one deviated a little bit from that, but it's like here you have a track about returning to old habits. You have some stuff about relationships. You have a bit about consumerism. You have a track about fame. And it's like the only connecting thread through these things is just a general sense of existential dread, which I kind of just feel like you expect at a base level from the genre a lot of the time, and it doesn't alone give the record a strong sense of identity. I guess this thing does use a lot of like road and like travel type imagery. And usually I love this type of thing because it can kind of suggest that someone's both physically wandering and emotionally wandering in a sense. But I guess here it's just like not used for much more than setting the scene. Whereas like on We Cool, for example, you had all of these locations to suggest that like everyone Jeff cares about is just scattered now and moving on. And it's really frustrating because I don't think that any individual issue that I have with this thing should be a deal breaker, but it's just so many small things stacked up against it at once. So, yeah. But I do want to talk about some of the moments in the songwriting that actually stuck with me because they definitely do exist. Like on No Dream, that detail where I guess Jeff and his partner are like watching the news and then he turns it off and just their reflection in the TV looks that much more eerie for like a split second because it's like, yeah, what you just saw is actually that outrageous and infuriating and heartbreaking, and you know, it's time to internalize that and react accordingly. Like, what's your next move? And I love Old Crap all around, just for how it suggests, like, letting that one habit or person that you spend every second trying not to think about just totally own you all over again. Because it's just so true that this just keeps happening again and again as you try to process anything bad happening to you, and yeah, the human brain is just kind of a resilient piece of shit, so yeah. I also really like Honeymoon Ashtray, which recalls these specific, like, physical details of Jeff and his wife's honeymoon and uses, like, an ashtray getting full as a metaphor for the magic between them being gone now. But then there's a point in this track where he realizes he's just creating an issue that wasn't even really there in reality. And I really fixated on the part where he said, like, you know what, it doesn't even matter a couple times. And then after that, actually elaborated on why it doesn't matter. Because it's like the first time he says it, you think he's just ripping on himself again. But it's like he catches himself. And you can see exactly where and why that shift in perspective happens. And following that, on Ohio Turnpike, you have the line, "Nobody wishes for what they already have, and we relive every misstep that we've made in our lives," which I just thought was a nice reminder that, like, you're never gonna just magically be completely sure of your current situation, and you're never actively thinking about the downsides to what you don't have, so just stop fucking thinking so much. And I also like how this track had a pretty just like standard and natural build to climax, because I just thought it was refreshing after all the fucking ruckus of the rest of the album. But yeah, I found this to overall be a pretty decent listen. It's not like my favorite in Jeff's catalog, but I'm convinced I'll never outright hate one of his projects, and I really hope me saying that doesn't jinx it. But yeah, next up I want to talk about the new Jessie Ware project, which in terms of grooves is honestly pretty airtight. Like, there isn't really a dud to be found on here. And the timbres are nice enough, I guess. Like, you have these plump, just rubbery bass lines with a bit of a pop to them, and you know, like more elastic and frisky synths. And some of them just have this very perfect, like, burnished finish about them, and maybe kind of like a gleam as well, like that melody on Soul Control that also sounds really sharp, so it's like straight up like copper wire finish. And then I really like the bass on In Your Eyes, because it just sounds so like thick and meaty and just like wobbles underneath everything. But then you also have the bass that's just like one note sliding up to the next, so it creates like a very physical nook in there, and I guess just these two things working together is very satisfying to me. And then in terms of like the more lightweight elements of the production, first of all, you have the strings, which are very sensational and just feel like wind blowing against your face. And also just in the gentler tracks, the synths just sound like they could be just like soft lights illuminating everything, like in Adore You. And also in these tracks, just Jesse's very whispery, temperate vocals just really agree with everything going on. But then I do kind of feel like they can start to pose problems when they're on these straight dance tracks that are really supposed to bang and pop and radiate brilliantly, like say the title track. Like this bass line just straight up sounds like you are strutting down a catwalk, but unfortunately her vocal delivery just kind of takes away the impact that it should have for me. And I don't know, it's not that I don't like her vocals, like I feel like they should feel just spine tingling, but they can only really do so when the production complements them. And that's probably why when the record hits Save a Kiss, I just feel so much more naturally swept up by what's going on. But I do feel like, at least in the beginning stretch of tracks, just her excitement to kind of indulge in this love affair could have felt way more convincing, and they could have been a lot more tangibly sensual. Like, I don't know, this could have felt like being in a limo in New York City, just sipping champagne and kissing the neck of the person you've just been dying to get with for so long. Like, that's a big moment. Like, sell it, you motherfucker. I don't know, I just get the gut feeling that this could have been a way more vivid experience than it is, and a little bit less stiff too, like both for that reason and just the fact that the appeal is really exclusively the grooves. And you know, it's like a cool little retro disco revivalism type thing, but I am kind of at a loss trying to see the quality that makes people love it, but that's just me. Next up, I want to talk about this new Ka record called Descendants of Cain, which, like, at a point, the only objective in Ka's life was survival itself. And I feel like his delivery being so blank and stony and deadpan just kind of reflects how mentally fixed he was, and how probably a million other parts of his mind had to be frozen, and how probably the emotion behind the situation just became so great and overwhelming that he couldn't even engage with it anymore. And the only thing that could possibly come out of him is sheer will and effort and physical strain towards something useful. Like, Put Food on the Table As Long As I'm Able-Bodied on Eye of the Needle just kind of shows how essentially he was a machine keeping himself alive. And also another factor of this is how he probably just didn't have a second to lose, which, you know, also on this track you have the lines, "It's a course, life course, you don't get to learn later," and "Losers die, winners caught a war scar," and "We chose short-sighted goals, not sought far." And also, there is the line, "Thought he was moving the solution without equating the problem" on Old Justice, which I think is meant to emphasize how he really only had time to address his own personal form of this issue, which ultimately has a much wider scope. And it's like, how many people's situations are exactly like this? And just everything about Ka strikes me as so bullshit-free and just focused. Like, even just quietly shifting all of your energy to rapping as a means of dealing with this is a really humble move, but also just his bars can get quite studious, or else they're just very raw recollections of events, or they're just low-key really slick. Like, for example, on Every Now and Then you have the line, "Had to blossom to grow roots," which I feel like could quite easily just fly over your head, but for me, that is just such a clever way to articulate what it's like to start with nothing and just have to persevere completely by yourself with no solid ground to stand on. And I also think it's really cool how on Patron Saints he kind of says that, like, all of his guides were people who just, like, slyly wriggled their way through an unfair system. And then there is also the detail on this track where he witnesses his father commit homicide, which just vividly portrays exactly how born into this life he was. And I also really like the beat on this track. There's like this piano sample that kind of manages to bridge the gap between cold-blooded and uplifting, and also a violin and these cavernous kicks that I think work really well together. And I also really like the beat on Unto the Dust. Like, there's a simplicity about it for sure. It's really just like about the bass's nook on your chest and the way that it progresses, and just the synths working along with it. But it literally just like puts this sense of silence into the track and emphasizes more that part where he sings, "On this earth, brave known to earn." However, I did notice that some of the beats didn't exactly progress in the most comfortable way. Like, I felt like the pianos on the second half of Solitude of Enoch very much sounded like they were carrying the momentum to some greater climax and not just outright ending the track. And I also felt like the beat switch on Eye of the Needle was pretty abrupt, but other than that, generally like all the beats on this thing. And I also really like the last track just because I feel like if you've been forced to just constantly be thick-skinned, it can almost be difficult to even understand where the hell Love This Unconditional comes from. So I thought it was really moving. And yeah, overall I thought this was quite a worthwhile listen. Next up, let's talk about this new King Krule album called Man Alive, which, you know, obviously King Krule's voice is quite something. It's just like this rabid, just deranged, emotionally turbulent bellowing and yelping, and I don't know, it's like he sounds like he just has gunk clogging his throat, or maybe like fucking mental illness is just clogging his system or something. And one thing I've noticed about just like his album experiences is that they tend to put you into a lull, and they're very numbing, like especially the ooze, which just to me kind of feels like going about life with just this shroud over your brain, or like a dark gray weight just over everything. And this album uses these pretty sour guitars and synthesizers and bass that has this charred, sandy texture about it, and also quite a groan. And there is a sense of panic here and there in the songwriting, which I feel is very well reinforced by just a couple of touches to the production. Like, in Stoned Again, the way that you can just hear him screaming his head off in the distance as simultaneously you have his main vocal melodies over that is just like this constant reminder that that's how he actually feels. And the way that you can just hear some woman yelling at him in Comet Face just gives it a very urgent sense of threat, I think. And also, you know, I don't know if this point makes any sense, honestly. But I feel like the way that King Krule portrays depression is kind of similar to the way it's portrayed in The Catcher in the Rye, like that book we were all forced to read in high school, which I haven't read in years, so honestly, who fucking knows? But it's just the way that he describes just like being lost and away from home and not knowing where to go, and just being like totally dilapidated and drunk and getting trashed as a coping mechanism. I guess just both physically and mentally feeling cornered. But then for part of this record, Archie has this very out of character hope in his system, and that's due to the way that he talks about this girl that he's either desperately infatuated with or in a relationship with. And that kind of gives this album like its own distinct identity in his discography, I think. And I also feel like it has quite a nautical, like seaside kind of feel to it, both because of the imagery in the songwriting and because of the way the saxes sound. But yeah, this is another great King Krule record that I would give a listen. And next up, I want to cover the new Laura Marling project called Song for Our Daughter, which uses these rustic acoustic guitar plucks and strums and stainless pianos and very melodramatic strings. And it has a really classic, just clean-cut presentation about it and recording quality, and just really sharply refined melodies. Like, they just seem to glide off each other just effortlessly. And I might like this a bit better just because I don't listen to nearly enough folk or Americana, so it's like the instrumentation seems a bit more flavorful than it should, and I admit that, but like this thing just puts images in my head of like cottages filled with antiques and like log cabins through forest and maybe like the tones in the sky when it's storming. Just basically some kind of moody, gloomy rural or pastoral scene. And most likely it's like I'm living there in isolation after a very long and twisted romantic history, and now I have no responsibility other than to reflect on it. And you know, it's kind of funny because there's so many instances to where I feel like publications use the descriptor mature to describe certain singer-songwriter records, and I can't pinpoint why, other than that, like, it's stylistically pretty simplistic and classy in that way, but I just kind of struggle to understand why these two things are now synonymous, but, I don't know, maybe there is some legitimacy to the idea that if you want your audience to just be people who appreciate subtle music, it makes you more down to earth. I don't know. But my point is, I feel like Laura Marling just encapsulates that label so well. And I guess part of that is probably because of her perspective on relationships. Like, she strikes me as so wise and perceptive, and it's like she just has everything down to a science, or she's as close as you could get to having everything down to a science. And you know, it almost convinces my fidgety ass to just feel totally collected and happy being alone and just safe in my skin. And I think part of that might be because she just highlights the harshest truths about them that seem to cut the deepest. Like, the end of the affair. Oh my god, where do I even start? Like, first of all, like, the way that on this track it almost sounds like she is sympathizing with this cheater protagonist and even framing the situation like, fuck your wife for caring. I don't know, it just makes me feel like, God, like, as we get older, do we just become like so miserable in our stale relationships that like cheating is just happening left and right? Like, I don't know, scares the shit out of me. And then there's the fact that Fortune mentions this running away fund that her mother kept for years, and I guess just the idea of an adult feeling so boxed into their life due to their kids and their marriage and maybe like their job, and just holding this quiet desperation inside of them that just builds over the years, and maybe getting to a point where the only remote sense of liberation they can find is in the idea of everything they remotely care about falling apart, kind of kills. As does Held Down, which captures the moment of shock when you wake up in the middle of the night and realize your partner just left. And I guess just the idea of like spending so long with someone and then them sort of reaching the verdict that you're pretty cool but ultimately not worth it is pretty hard to think about. And I also really like the vocal flourishes that just kind of escalate on this track. And then I love Strange Girl for how it has this very classic sounding instrumentation, but then the lyrics are about these rebellious types that aren't designed to fit into the world, really. I find that to be a pretty satisfying juxtaposition. And I also just kind of love the idea of like a fully grown adult still kind of looking on these mindsets a bit sentimentally and sympathizing with them to an extent, and suggesting like, yeah, there is actually enough bullshit in the world for, you know, being pissed off by default to kind of make sense, and for these behaviors to continue, for you to just squirm or scramble to find a solution with these very dramatic, impulsive mindset changes. And in a way, I think this record just kind of makes me realize that nothing's really that bad until it's truly bad, which Blow by Blow kind of summarizes, and just reminds me that it helps keep your perspective really grounded when you kind of just see life as these root tragedies or breakdowns and then the areas in between, because it helps you appreciate everything that isn't totally cataclysmic that much more. But yeah, this record just makes me feel like I could grow up and get to a place where I have art and a very clear perspective on the past, and I just don't need anything more. Which is why I love it. And last thing I want to cover in this episode is Drop 6 by Little Sims, which, it's funny, in retrospect, I feel like the main thing that I can take away from this is the way that it literally presents a detail of the behind the scenes of an artist's life that you would never be actively thinking about. Like, just because she was so frank about the fact that she was only doing this to pay bills. And the way that she just didn't have a second to lose at the start of quarantine. So it's very realistic and straight to the point in that way. And I think that the best part about the content itself is probably her, like, just because there's an assured swagger about her deliveries and her flows and lyrics, but even those are not constantly ablaze. Like, she can just kind of wind down, and there isn't a whole lot of color to the production here. Like, it is very stark and skin and bones, and there is a lot of reliance on the drums and the bass, which isn't always the worst thing in the world, but I do kind of feel like it can detract from this experience. And that'll conclude episode 2 of my 2020 roundup. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching the whole thing if for some reason you did, and I'll see you in episode 3 sometime in the future. Love you, and keep drinking water from my buddy Liam, the music reviewer.